On a rain-soaked Thursday night in downtown Portland, Oregon, fate orchestrated an encounter that would shatter every boundary between heroism and humiliation, between saving a life and discovering that some rescues come with consequences no good deed should ever bear. Joshua Hernandez, a 34-year-old software developer and devoted single father, had no idea that pulling an unconscious woman from a burning Mercedes would transform his quiet, predictable world into something resembling a corporate thriller, where the villain wears designer suits and the hero clocks in at 9 a.m. sharp. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The neon lights of Pioneer Square reflected off the wet asphalt as Joshua hurried through the October drizzle, his worn leather jacket pulled tight against the Portland chill. He just finished another exhausting parent-teacher conference for his 8-year-old daughter, Luna, where her teacher had praised her creativity while gently suggesting that single parenting was quite challenging, in that tone teachers reserved for families they pitied. The conference had run late, and now he was rushing to catch the last MAX train to their small apartment in the Hawthorne district, where Luna waited with Mrs. Patterson, their elderly neighbor who watched her during these evening obligations. The explosion shattered the evening calm like breaking glass. Joshua spun toward the sound, his programmer's mind instantly cataloging the scene. Overturned silver Mercedes, steam rising from the crumpled hood, the acrid smell of burning rubber, and something far more dangerous, gasoline. The car had apparently hydroplaned on the slick streets, crashed through the decorative barrier, and now sat smoking ominously near the Pioneer Courthouse Square fountain. Other pedestrians were pulling out phones, recording, calling 911, but none were moving toward the wreckage. That's when he saw her. Through the spider-webbed driver's side window, a woman slumped unconscious against the deployed airbag, blood trickling from a gash on her forehead. She appeared to be in her early 30s, with dark auburn hair and an expensive-looking navy blazer that suggested she was someone important, someone who definitely didn't belong in burning cars on random Thursday nights. Her face was peaceful, almost serene, despite the chaos surrounding her, and something about that contradiction drove Joshua forward. "Hey," he called to the growing crowd of onlookers, "someone call 911. The car's gonna catch fire." But Joshua didn't wait. His father had been a firefighter before cancer took him when Joshua was 16, and some lessons carved themselves deep into your bones. He could hear his dad's voice now. When someone is in danger, you don't calculate the risk, you eliminate it. The driver's door was crumpled shut, but the passenger side had taken less damage. Joshua grabbed a decorative rock from the square's landscaping and struck the window with practiced precision, the safety glass crumbling into manageable chunks. The smell hit him immediately. Gasoline was definitely leaking, and the engine was making that particular ticking sound that meant heat and fuel were getting too friendly. "Ma'am," he called, climbing carefully through the window space. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" No response. Her pulse was strong, but her breathing shallow. Up close, he could see she was beautiful in that polished professional way that belonged in corner offices and boardrooms, not in crashed cars with a stranger's hands checking her vitals. Her blazer bore a small enamel pin, some kind of corporate logo he didn't recognize, and her briefcase had spilled open, scattering documents across the passenger seat. The engine's ticking grew more urgent. Joshua worked his arms under her shoulders and knees, grateful for the hours he spent lifting weights in their apartment building's tiny gym, a habit he'd developed after Luna's birth, when single parenting had made him realize he needed to stay strong for both of them. She was heavier than she looked, but he managed to extract her from the wreckage just as the first flames began to lick at the engine compartment. They were 20 feet away when the car erupted. The explosion knocked them both to the wet pavement, Joshua instinctively shielding the unconscious woman with his body as debris rained down around them. His ears rang, his jacket was torn, and his left shoulder screamed in protest, but they were alive. The woman stirred in his arms, her eyelids fluttering. "Don't move," Joshua said softly, his EMT training from college kicking in automatically. "You are in an accident. Help is coming." Her eyes opened, striking green, the color of sea glass, and focused on his face with surprising clarity. For a moment they simply stared at each other, this stranger and her accidental savior, surrounded by the chaos of emergency sirens and the burning wreckage of what had nearly been her tomb. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice cultured and professional despite her circumstances. But then something else crossed her features, a flicker of recognition perhaps, or calculation. I have to go."
She tried to sit up, and Joshua gently restrained her. "Ma'am, you need medical attention. You were unconscious, and head injuries. Please." Her grip on his arm was surprisingly strong. "I can't be here when they arrive. You don't understand. This wasn't an accident." Before Joshua could process what she meant, paramedics were pushing through the crowd, and the mysterious woman was allowing herself to be loaded onto a stretcher. She caught his eyes one last time as they wheeled her toward the ambulance, and something in her expression suggested this wasn't over, that their paths would cross again in ways neither of them could anticipate. A police officer took Joshua's statement, praising his quick thinking and heroic actions. The local news crew arrived just as he was finishing, but Joshua declined interviews, too exhausted and worried about getting home to Luna. He gave his contact information, picked up his torn jacket, and caught the last train home, where he found his daughter asleep on the couch and Mrs. Patterson knitting in his recliner. "Rough night?" she asked, noticing his disheveled appearance. "You could say that," Joshua replied, though he had no idea how rough it was about to get. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, Portland's October sky scrubbed clean by the previous night's rain. Joshua went through his usual routine: coffee at 6 a.m., Luna's breakfast at 6:30, walking her to Bridal Mile Elementary at 7:15, and arriving at TechFlow Solutions' downtown office by 8:45. He'd worked as a senior developer for the mid-sized software company for 3 years, ever since Luna started school, and he could manage a traditional schedule. The work was steady, the benefits decent, and his colleagues were the kind of introverted, brilliant people who respected his need to leave promptly at 5 to pick up his daughter. But today felt different. There was an unusual energy in the office, hushed conversations by the coffee machine, and several people had dressed more formally than usual. Joshua was debugging a particularly stubborn piece of code when his supervisor, Dave Chen, he needed a different name, when his supervisor, Dave Rodriguez, approached his desk with an expression that mixed excitement and nervousness. "Josh, we need you in conference room A. The whole development team. We're meeting the new CEO." Joshua saved his work and followed Dave down the hallway, wondering what had happened to their previous CEO, Martha Williams, who'd seemed perfectly content running TechFlow just last week. Corporate transitions were never good news for employees, especially single fathers who couldn't afford to job hunt. Conference room A was packed with familiar faces, the entire 30-person development staff plus department heads in senior management. Everyone was standing around awkwardly waiting for the main event. Joshua found a spot near the back, checking his phone for any messages from Luna's school. "Ladies and gentlemen," came the voice of Harold Kim, TechFlow's founder and chairman of the board. "I'd like you to meet our new Chief Executive Officer, someone whose innovative approach to tech leadership and corporate restructuring has made her one of the youngest executives in the Pacific Northwest. Please join me in welcoming Victoria Ashford." The conference room door opened, and Joshua's world tilted sideways. Walking into the room with confident, measured steps was the woman he'd pulled from the burning car less than 18 hours earlier. Her auburn hair was now perfectly styled, the cut on her forehead hidden beneath expertly applied concealer, and her navy blazer, or one identical to it, looked fresh from the dry cleaner. She moved with the kind of authority that commanded attention, her sea-glass green eyes scanning the room with the assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating assets and liabilities. Those same eyes found Joshua in the back of the room and held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds, long enough for him to see the recognition, the calculation, and something that might have been amusement before she looked away and began addressing the room. "Thank you, Harold," Victoria Ashford said, her voice carrying easily through the conference room. "I'm excited to work with such a talented team." But Joshua had stopped listening. His mind was racing through the implications, the impossibilities, the sheer cosmic joke of it all. The woman whose life he had saved, who whispered about accidents that weren't accidents, who disappeared into an ambulance with secrets in her eyes, was now his boss. Not just any boss, the CEO of his company. The person who would determine his future, his daughter's future, their entire life. And judging by the way Victoria Ashford had looked at him, she remembered every detail of their dramatic first meeting. Before we dive deeper into Joshua's incredible journey, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love connecting with our community around the world. And if this story has you hooked already, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because what happens next will challenge everything you think you know about fate, corporate power, and what it really means to save someone's life. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single twist in this unbelievable true story. Tomorrow, we'll reveal what Victoria Ashford was really running from that night, and why Joshua's heroic act may have put both him and Luna in more danger than he could ever imagine. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
The alarm clock's shrill cry pierced through Joshua Hernandez's apartment at 5:30 a.m., the same time it had every morning for the past 3 years. He rolled over in his narrow twin bed. Luna had claimed the master bedroom when they'd moved to this one-bedroom apartment in Portland's Hawthorne district, because 8-year-old girls needed space for their dreams, even if 34-year-old fathers had to fold themselves into furniture designed for college students. The photograph on his nightstand caught the early morning light filtering through their thin curtains. In it, a younger Joshua stood beside Elena Vasquez, both of them grinning at the camera while holding a newborn Luna between them. Elena's dark eyes sparkled with the kind of joy that seemed impossible to extinguish. Her nurse's scrubs wrinkled from a long shift, but her smile radiant as she gazed down at their daughter. The photo had been taken 6 years ago, back when Joshua still believed that love was enough to hold a family together, before he learned that some people were meant to be free spirits and others were meant to raise children, and rarely were they the same person. Elena had left on a Tuesday morning when Luna was 2. No dramatic fight, no bitter accusations. Just a note on the kitchen counter explaining that she wasn't built for the daily grind of parenthood, that she needed to find herself somewhere that didn't include diaper changes in daycare schedules. The divorce papers had arrived 3 weeks later, along with sporadic child support payments that stopped altogether when Elena moved to Costa Rica to teach yoga and heal her soul. Joshua padded to their small kitchen in bare feet, stepping carefully around Luna's art supplies scattered across the linoleum floor. His daughter had inherited her mother's creativity, but channeled it into elaborate drawings of fantastical creatures and detailed architectural plans for tree houses they couldn't afford to build. Last night's masterpiece, a purple dragon wearing a business suit, was taped proudly to the refrigerator next to Luna's school lunch menu and a past due notice from Portland General Electric. The coffee maker coughed to life, a second-hand machine he'd bought at Goodwill that had more personality than reliability. While it wheezed through its brewing cycle, Joshua opened the refrigerator and performed his daily mathematics. Eggs, 3 left. Milk, enough for Luna's cereal. Bread, 2 slices remaining, and a collection of condiment packets from various fast food restaurants that had become their backup dinner plan more often than he cared to admit. His laptop sat open on their small dining table, surrounded by code printouts and sticky notes covered in his angular handwriting. Joshua had been working on a freelance project after Luna went to bed, a mobile app for a local food truck collective that paid just enough to cover the gap between his TechFlow salary and their monthly expenses. The work was tedious, but it meant Luna could stay in her current school, could keep taking the art classes that made her eyes light up, could maintain some stability in a life that had already seen too much upheaval. "Daddy?" Luna's sleepy voice drifted from the bedroom doorway. She appeared in her favorite pajamas, a faded set decorated with rockets and planets that she had outgrown months ago but refused to abandon. Her dark hair, so much like Elena's, stuck up in impossible directions, and she clutched a stuffed elephant named Professor Trunk that had been her constant companion since infancy. "Morning, sunshine," Joshua said, forcing brightness into his voice despite the exhaustion that seemed to have taken permanent residence in his bones. "Ready for another adventure at Bridal Mile Elementary?" Luna climbed onto one of their mismatched dining chairs, her legs swinging freely as she watched him pour cereal into her bowl. She had Elena's eyes, but Joshua's thoughtful expression, a combination that made her seem older than her years. Sometimes he caught her studying him with a concern that no 8-year-old should carry, as if she could sense the weight he tried so hard to hide. "Mrs. Patterson said you were out late last night," Luna said, accepting the bowl of generic brand cereal with the solemnity of a queen receiving tribute. "She said there were fire trucks and everything." Joshua paused in his coffee preparation. Mrs. Patterson, their elderly neighbor who watched Luna during his evening obligations, had a talent for gathering neighborhood gossip with the efficiency of an intelligence operative. "I helped someone who was in trouble," he said carefully. "Nothing for you to worry about." "Were you a hero again?" The question caught him off guard. Luna had a habit of asking the kinds of questions that required truthful answers, even when the truth was complicated. She'd started calling him a hero after parent-teacher conferences, after working late nights to pay our bills, after any of the small battles that single parenthood required him to fight daily. "I just did what anyone would do," Joshua replied, settling across from her with his coffee mug, a Father's Day gift from Luna's preschool class that read, "World's #1 Dad," in fading purple letters. "Not anyone," Luna said with the certainty that children brought to moral absolutes. "Mrs. Patterson said most people just watch and take videos now. She said real heroes are getting rarer like pandas." Joshua nearly choked on his coffee. Trust his daughter to compare heroism to endangered species with perfect 8-year-old logic. "Pandas?" "Both are important and both need protection," Luna explained, seriously, then grinned. "Plus, they're both fuzzy around the edges."
This was why he fought so hard to maintain their life, Joshua realized, watching his daughter's face light up with her own cleverness. These moments of pure Luna logic, where she could find profound meaning in breakfast conversation and make him laugh despite the stack of unpaid bills on his desk. His phone buzzed against the table. A text from Dave Rodriguez, his supervisor at TechFlow. "Big changes coming today. New CEO meeting at 9. Dress nicely." Joshua frowned at the message. Martha Williams had seemed perfectly stable as their CEO just last week. Corporate transitions were never good news for employees, especially those without the flexibility to job hunt or relocate. He thought about the freelance project waiting on his laptop, the careful budget calculations that kept them afloat, the delicate balance that made their life possible. "What's wrong, Daddy?" Luna had finished her cereal and was studying him with that too perceptive expression that reminded him uncomfortably of Elena's ability to read his moods. "Nothing's wrong, sweetheart," he said, sliding his phone into his pocket. "Just work stuff. Grown-up things that aren't nearly as interesting as whatever Professor Trunk is planning for today." Luna hugged her stuffed elephant tighter. "He's planning to help me with my presentation on community helpers. I'm going to talk about how you're a software developer and a hero and how those are basically the same job because you both solve problems that other people can't fix." The innocence in her voice, The absolute faith she had in his abilities made Joshua's chest tighten with equal parts love and terror. What would happen to that faith if he couldn't maintain their precarious stability? What would happen if the corporate changes at TechFlow meant budget cuts, layoffs, or relocations he couldn't afford? They went through their morning routine with practiced efficiency. Luna brushing her teeth while Joshua packed her lunch, peanut butter and jelly, an apple, and a juice box, both of them gathering backpacks and jackets, the walk to Bridal Mile Elementary through Portland's tree-lined streets where other families moved through their own morning choreography. At the school gate, Luna hugged him with the fierce intensity she brought to everything important. "Have a good day at work, Daddy. Try not to hero too hard." "I'll do my best," Joshua promised, watching her run toward her classroom with Professor Trunk tucked under her arm. The MAX train into downtown Portland was crowded with the usual collection of commuters, students, and service workers beginning another day in a city that prided itself on being weird but often forgot to be affordable. Joshua found a seat near the window and watched the familiar landscape roll past, the Hawthorne Bridge spanning the Willamette River, the downtown skyline growing larger with each stop, the mixture of old brick buildings and modern glass towers that gave Portland its distinctive character. TechFlow Solutions occupied 3 floors of a converted warehouse in the Pearl District, the kind of space that had been trendy when the company was founded 5 years ago. The building still smelled faintly of the coffee roastery that had operated there previously, and the exposed brick walls were decorated with motivational posters about innovation and teamwork that no one really read anymore. Joshua's desk sat in the middle of the open-plan office, surrounded by the controlled chaos of a development team in perpetual motion. Dual monitors displayed code that would help small businesses manage their inventory, nothing glamorous but solid work that solved real problems for real people. His workspace was noticeably neat compared to his colleagues. Single parenthood had taught him that organization was the difference between functioning and drowning. Dave Rodriguez appeared at his desk just before 9, looking uncharacteristically formal in a pressed shirt and tie. "Are you ready for the big meeting?" he asked, but his expression carried an undercurrent of nervous energy that put Joshua on edge. "Any idea what this is about?" Joshua asked, saving his work and following Dave toward conference room A. "Martha Williams resigned yesterday. Emergency board meeting, new CEO approved overnight. Word is she's some kind of corporate restructuring specialist." Joshua's stomach dropped. Restructuring specialists were corporate speak for people who fired employees and sold assets to improve quarterly reports. As they walked down the hallway toward the conference room, Joshua thought about Luna's presentation on community helpers, about the careful budget that kept them afloat, about the fragile stability they'd built over 3 years of single parenthood. Conference room A was packed with familiar faces, the entire development staff plus department heads and senior management. Everyone looked slightly uncomfortable, like actors who'd forgotten their lines in a play they'd never auditioned for. Joshua found a spot near the back, checking his phone reflexively for any messages from Luna's school, a habit he'd developed since becoming the only parent responsible for emergency calls. Harold Kim, TechFlow's founder and chairman of the board, stood at the front of the room with the kind of nervous energy that preceded major announcements. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I'd like you to meet our new Chief Executive Officer." And then, the impossible happened. The conference room door opened, and walking in with confident, measured steps was the woman Joshua had pulled from a burning Mercedes less than 18 hours earlier. Her auburn hair was perfectly styled, the cut on her forehead hidden beneath expertly applied concealer, and she moved with the kind of authority that belonged in boardrooms, not in burning cars where strangers risked their lives to save hers. Those sea-glass green eyes found his in the crowd, held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds, and in that brief moment, Joshua understood that his carefully constructed world, the delicate balance of single parenthood, steady employment, and quiet stability, was about to change in ways he couldn't begin to anticipate. The woman whose life he'd saved was now the person who controlled his future, Luna's future, everything they'd built together. And judging by the calculation in Victoria Ashford's eyes as she began addressing the room, she remembered every detail of their dramatic first meeting. Joshua's hands clenched in his lap as he listened to his new boss speak, already calculating how many freelance projects he'd need to survive a potential layoff, how he'd explain another job change to Luna, how he'd maintain the hero status his daughter had bestowed upon him, when his heroic act might have just destroyed their lives. The boardroom of Meridian Capital Management occupied the entire 42nd floor of the Columbia Center, Seattle's tallest building, where floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of Elliott Bay and the Olympic Mountains beyond. At precisely 7:30 a.m., 3 hours before she would walk into TechFlow Solutions as the new CEO, Victoria Ashford sat across from three men who controlled more wealth than most small countries' GDP. Her head still throbbed from the previous night's accident, but she'd learned long ago that showing weakness in rooms like this was tantamount to signing your own corporate death warrant. The concealer covering her forehead injury had cost more than most people spent on groceries in a month, applied by a makeup artist who specialized in making corporate executives look invincible even when they were falling apart. "The hostile takeover of TechFlow is proceeding exactly as planned," announced Marcus Rothwell, Meridian Capital's founding partner, his silver hair gleaming under the conference room's recessed lighting. At 68, Rothwell had perfected the art of corporate predation, acquiring and dismantling mid-sized companies with the efficiency of a surgeon removing tumors. The board voted unanimously to accept your interim CEO position. They believe you're there to stabilize operations before an acquisition. Victoria's manicured fingers traced the edge of her tablet where the actual TechFlow financial reports were displayed. Not the sanitized versions the board had seen, but the actual numbers that revealed a profitable, innovative company with enormous untapped potential. "They have no idea I'm planning to prevent the acquisition," she said quietly. "Which brings us to our little problem," interjected Damian Cross, Meridian's head of strategic operations, a man whose boyish face concealed the ruthless mind of someone who specialized in corporate espionage. "Your conscience is becoming expensive, Victoria. Very expensive." The third man hadn't spoken yet, but his presence dominated the room like a gathering storm. Vincent Kane operated in the shadows of corporate America, the kind of person who cleaned up messes that traditional security firms wouldn't touch. His companies had been linked to industrial accidents, data breaches, and the occasional disappearance of inconvenient whistleblowers, though nothing had ever been proven in court. "Last night's brake failure was meant to be final," Kane said, his flat affect carrying the air of someone discussing quarterly projections rather than attempted murder. "Your survival complicates our timeline considerably." Victoria had known this confrontation was coming since the moment she'd crawled from the wreckage of her Mercedes, since the stranger with kind eyes had risked his life to pull her from what was supposed to be her fiery grave. For 6 months, she'd been Meridian Capital's golden child, the brilliant acquisition specialist who could walk into any company and identify the most efficient ways to extract maximum value before dissolution. She'd been very good at her job. Too good, apparently, because she'd eventually realized she was helping to destroy everything she'd once believed in. The transformation had begun 8 weeks ago, during her evaluation of Brennan Industries, a family-owned manufacturing company in Spokane that had been producing sustainable building materials for 3 generations. Victoria had spent 2 weeks embedded in their operations, preparing her standard recommendation for asset stripping and workforce reduction, when she'd made a crucial mistake. She'd started talking to the employees. Maria Santos, a single mother of 3 who'd worked the production line for 12 years, had shown Victoria pictures of her daughter's graduation, made possible by the company's tuition assistance program. Tom Brennan, the founder's grandson, had walked her through their innovative recycling process that turned construction waste into eco-friendly insulation. The night shift supervisor, a Vietnam veteran named Robert Kim, had explained how the company's health insurance had covered his wife's cancer treatments when other employers would have found excuses to let him go. For the first time in her career, Victoria had seen past the balance sheets and profit margins to the human cost of her recommendations. Brennan Industries wasn't just a collection of assets to be liquidated. It was a community, a legacy, a source of hope and stability for hundreds of families who'd built their lives around the promise that hard work and loyalty would be rewarded. She had submitted a report recommending against acquisition, citing market volatility and regulatory complications. Meridian Capital had proceeded anyway, using her operational analysis to identify the most valuable assets and the most expendable employees. Within 6 weeks, 300 people had lost their jobs, and the Brennan family had watched their grandfather's legacy dissolve into series of shell companies and tax shelters.
"I've been researching your background, Victoria," Cross continued, sliding a manila folder across the polished table. "Fascinating reading. Did you know that your rescue last night made the local news? Hero saves mystery woman from burning car. The reporter couldn't identify you, of course, but we have better resources." Victoria opened the folder, her stomach dropping as she saw surveillance photos of Joshua Hernandez walking Luna to school that morning. More photos showed their small apartment building, the Bridal Mile Elementary School entrance, even Luna's artwork displayed in her classroom window. The message was unmistakably clear: refuse to cooperate, and innocent people would pay the price. "Joshua Hernandez?" she asked, her voice steadied despite the rage building in her chest. "We're clarifying expectations," Rothwell corrected smoothly. "You will proceed with the TechFlow acquisition as planned. You will identify the key personnel for retention, recommend the appropriate workforce reductions, and prepare the company for asset liquidation. Any deviation from this plan will result in unfortunate accidents, starting with your new friends." Kane leaned forward slightly, his predator's eyes fixed on Victoria's face. The break failure was meant to be a clean ending to an unfortunate chapter. Your continued existence creates complications that require more creative solutions. Solutions that might involve collateral damage. Victoria closed the folder, her mind racing through contingencies she'd hoped never to need. For months, she'd been preparing for this moment, quietly documenting Meridian Capital's illegal activities, building relationships with federal investigators, and establishing secure communication channels with journalists who specialized in corporate corruption. She'd known that eventually her conscience would put her at odds with people who measured success in quarterly profits and human suffering. What she hadn't expected was for a stranger's heroism to complicate everything. "I understand the expectations," she said finally, standing to signal the meeting's end. "TechFlow will be prepared for acquisition within 90 days. "Excellent," Rothwell smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. "After all, you've always been our most pragmatic operative." As Victoria rode the elevator down 42 floors, she studied her reflection in the polished steel doors. The woman staring back at her looked like every other corporate executive in Seattle. Expensive suit, perfect makeup, the kind of polished professionalism that opened doors and closed hearts. But behind her sea-glass eyes, she was calculating variables that her former partners could never anticipate. Meridian Capital had made 2 critical errors. First, they'd assumed that their leverage over Joshua and Luna would make her compliant, when it actually gave her something worth fighting for. Something more valuable than her own survival. Second, they'd revealed the full scope of their surveillance capabilities, which meant she now knew exactly what resources they had and how they intended to use them. The drive from Seattle to Portland gave her 2 hours to refine her strategy. By the time she walked into TechFlow Solutions as the new CEO, Victoria Ashford would no longer be Meridian Capital's acquisition specialist. She would be something far more dangerous, a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to protect. Her phone buzzed with a text from Cross. "Remember, we're watching. Don't disappoint us." Victoria deleted the message and scrolled through her contacts until she found the encrypted number she'd hoped never to use. The text she sent was brief. "Package delivered. Need extraction protocols activated within 48 hours. Priority Alpha." The response came immediately. "Confirmed. Welcome to the Resistance." As she parked in TechFlow's garage, she allowed herself one moment of pure terror at what she was about to attempt. Infiltrating a company to destroy it was one thing. Infiltrating a company to save it while protecting the man who'd risked his life for a stranger required skills she'd never developed and resources she wasn't sure existed. But when she thought about Luna's innocent face in those surveillance photos, about Joshua's kind eyes as he'd pulled her from the wreckage, about the hundreds of families who would lose everything if Meridian Capital succeeded, the terror transformed into something infinitely more powerful: hope. Victoria straightened her blazer, checked her reflection one final time, and walked toward the elevator that would carry her into the most important performance of her life. In Conference Room A, 30 TechFlow employees waited to meet their new CEO, unaware that their fate and the fate of a small family in Hawthorne now depended on whether a former corporate predator could learn to be a protector. The man who'd saved her life sat in the back of the room, his expression a mixture of confusion and growing concern. He had no idea that his heroic act had just made him the most important person in a war between corporate greed and human decency. A war that would determine whether communities like his survived or became casualties in the endless pursuit of profit. As the elevator doors opened onto TechFlow's floor, Victoria realized that for the first time in her career, success wouldn't be measured in dollars or market share, but in the preservation of something far more precious: hope.
The coffee shop, 3 blocks from TechFlow Solutions, was the kind of place that catered to Portland's army of remote workers and caffeine-dependent professionals. Exposed brick walls lined with locally sourced art, mismatched furniture that somehow achieved perfect harmony, and a menu written in chalk on reclaimed barnwood that changed daily based on the owner's mood and available ingredients. At 3:47 p.m. on a Friday afternoon, it was nearly empty except for a few dedicated laptop warriors and one very uncomfortable software developer who just received the most surreal text message of his life. Need to talk. Meet me at Grind Coffee on Morrison. Come alone. V.A. Joshua stared at his phone for the 3rd time in 5 minutes, still unable to process that his new CEO, the woman he'd pulled from a burning car 48 hours earlier, was requesting a clandestine meeting like some kind of corporate spy thriller. He'd spent the past 2 days in a state of professional whiplash, watching Victoria Ashford navigate TechFlow's operations with the precision of someone who'd studied their systems for months rather than hours. Her first company-wide meeting had been a masterclass in strategic ambiguity. She'd spoken about maximizing human capital, streamlining operational efficiency, and exploring new growth opportunities with the kind of corporate speak that could mean anything from promotions to mass layoffs. But Joshua had caught something in her delivery that his colleagues had missed: the slight pause before certain phrases, the way her eyes found specific faces in the crowd, the subtle emphasis on words like protection and stability. She was telling them something, but in a code he couldn't crack. Now, sitting in a corner booth with a view of the entrance, Joshua nursed a cup of fair trade Ethiopian blend and tried to prepare for a conversation he couldn't begin to anticipate. Victoria arrived at exactly 4 p.m., moving through the coffee shop with the measured confidence he'd observed during her TechFlow presentations, but something about her posture suggested hypervigilance, the kind of awareness that came from expecting threats from multiple directions. She'd changed from her corporate armor into dark jeans, a moss-green sweater that brought out her eyes, and a leather jacket that managed to look both casual and expensive. Without the boardroom setting and formal attire, she looked younger, more approachable, but also more vulnerable in ways that made Joshua's protective instincts stir uncomfortably. "Thank you for coming," Victoria said, sliding into the booth across from him. Up close, she could see that the cut on her forehead was healing well, though she still favored her left side slightly when she moved. "I know this must seem strange." "Strange doesn't begin to cover it," Joshua replied, studying her face for clues about her intentions. 2 days ago, I didn't know you existed. Now you're my boss and you're texting me secret meeting requests? I'm starting to feel like I've wandered into someone else's life." Victoria signaled the barista for coffee, then leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice. "What I'm about to tell you will sound impossible, but I need you to listen carefully. Your life, Luna's life, may depend on understanding what's really happening." The mention of his daughter's name made Joshua's blood run cold. "How do you know about Luna?"
"Because the people who tried to kill me know about her too," Victoria said, her directness cutting through any pretense of casual conversation. "They have surveillance photos of your school, your apartment, even her artwork in the classroom windows. They're using her as leverage to ensure my compliance with their plans." Joshua's coffee cup rattled against the saucer as he set it down, his hand suddenly unsteady. What plans? Who are they, and why the hell would anyone threaten an 8-year-old girl because her father helped a stranger? Victoria glanced around the coffee shop, confirming they weren't being observed, then pulled out her phone and showed him a series of encrypted messages. Meridian Capital Management is a corporate acquisition firm that specializes in hostile takeovers of mid-sized companies. They identify profitable businesses with strong community ties, infiltrate their operations, then dismantle them for maximum short-term profit while destroying the long-term value for everyone else. She swiped to another screen showing financial projections and corporate organizational charts. TechFlow was targeted because your company has developed proprietary software solutions that could revolutionize supply chain management for small businesses. Instead of licensing the technology or partnering for mutual benefit, Meridian wants to acquire TechFlow, strip out the valuable intellectual property, lay off 90% of the workforce, and sell the remaining assets to the highest bidder. Joshua felt the coffee shop's warm atmosphere turn cold around him. "And you're here to make that happen?" "I was," Victoria admitted. Her voice carried the weight of past decisions that couldn't be undone. "For 3 years, I was Meridian's most effective acquisition specialist. I could walk into any company, identify the most efficient extraction methods, and recommend strategies that maximized shareholder returns while minimizing acquisition costs. I was very good at destroying things." "What changed?" Victoria's fingers traced patterns on the wooden table as she spoke, her eyes distant with memory. Brennan Industries, a family-owned manufacturing company in Spokane that had been producing sustainable building materials for 3 generations. I spent 2 weeks embedded in their operations preparing my standard asset stripping recommendations when I made the mistake of actually talking to the employees. She told him about Maria Santos at her daughter's graduation, about Tom Brennan's innovative recycling processes, about Robert Kim's wife and the cancer treatments that company insurance had covered. As she spoke, Joshua recognized something familiar in her voice. The same tone he used when talking about Luna's art projects or her school achievements. The unconscious warmth that crept in when describing people you'd learned to care about. "I submitted a report recommending against acquisition," Victoria continued, "but Meridian proceeded anyway, using my operational analysis to identify which assets to keep and which people to fire. 300 families lost their livelihoods because I'd shown them exactly how to maximize the damage." "So you decided to fight back?" "I decided to stop being complicit," she corrected. "For the past 4 months, I've been documenting Meridian's illegal activities, building relationships with federal investigators, and establishing secure communication channels with journalists who specialize in corporate corruption. I thought I could expose them from the inside and disappear before they realized what was happening." Victoria's phone buzzed with a notification she immediately silenced. "But they figured out what I was doing. The brake failure 2 nights ago wasn't an accident. It was meant to be a permanent solution to their problem with my conscience. When that failed, they decided to use different leverage." Joshua thought about Luna's innocent questions at breakfast, her absolute faith in his ability to protect her from anything that might threaten their small family. Why didn't they just fire you? Why go through this elaborate charade of making you CEO? "Because I know too much about their other operations, and a former employee turning whistleblower would be harder to discredit than a current employee who suffered a tragic accident," Victoria explained. "Also, they need my specific expertise to identify TechFlow's most valuable assets and personnel. They want me to do the analysis work, then disappear in a way that looks natural." "And if you refuse?" Victoria showed him one of the surveillance photos of Luna walking into Bridal Mile Elementary. her small backpack decorated with rainbow patches and her stuffed elephant tucked under one arm. Vincent Kane specializes in making problems disappear. His track record includes industrial accidents, data breaches, and the occasional disappearance of inconvenient individuals. He views collateral damage as an acceptable cost of business. The coffee shop's ambient noise, conversations, espresso machine hissing, soft jazz from hidden speakers, seemed to fade as Joshua processed the implications of his simple act of heroism had somehow entangled his family in a corporate conspiracy that threatened everything he'd built since Elena left. Worse, it had put Luna in danger from people who viewed 8-year-old girls as acceptable casualties in their profit calculations. "What do you want from me?" he asked, finally. "Help," Victoria said simply. "I have a plan to expose Meridian Capital and protect TechFlow, but I can't do it alone. I need someone inside the company who understands the technology, knows the employees, and has access to systems that I can't reach without raising suspicions." Joshua studied her face, searching for signs of deception or manipulation. What he found instead was exhaustion beneath the professional composure, the kind of bone-deep weariness that came from carrying burdens too heavy for one person to bear. She looked like he'd felt during those first months after Elena left, when every decision carried the weight of his daughter's future, and failure wasn't an option he could afford to take. "Why should I trust you?" he asked. 24 hours ago, you were planning to destroy my company and put my colleagues out of work. Now you're asking me to risk my daughter's safety based on your word that you've had a change of heart." Victoria reached into her leather jacket and withdrew a small device that looked like a modified USB drive. "Because I'm giving you this," she said, sliding it across the table. "It contains copies of all the evidence I've gathered about Meridian Capital's operations, financial records, internal communications, documentation of their involvement in other hostile takeovers, and proof of their illegal surveillance activities. If something happens to me, you can deliver this to the FBI contact whose information is encrypted on the drive." Joshua pocketed the device, feeling its weight like a physical manifestation of the responsibility he was accepting. "And if I refuse to help? Then I'll do everything I can to minimize the damage when Meridian takes over TechFlow, and I'll pray that Vincent Kane decides your family isn't worth his attention once I'm gone. But Joshua, these people don't leave loose ends. The moment you pulled me from that car, you became part of their story. The only question now is whether we write the ending together or let them write it for us." Outside the coffee shop windows, Portland's Friday afternoon traffic crawled through the intersection, while pedestrians hurried along sidewalks damp with the persistent drizzle that defined the city's character. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that in a corner booth nearby, two strangers were planning to wage war against forces that treated human communities like commodities to be traded and discarded.
Joshua thought about Luna's presentation on community helpers, about her fierce hug at the school gate that morning, about the careful budget calculations that kept their life stable and secure. Then he thought about Maria Santos and her daughter's graduation, about the 300 families who'd lost their livelihoods because profit margins mattered more than human dignity. "What's the plan?" he asked. Victoria's smile was the first genuinely warm expression he'd seen from her since that moment of recognition in the burning car. "We're going to give Meridian Capital exactly what they want, a detailed analysis of TechFlow's operations that identifies every valuable asset and key employee. But we're also going to make sure that analysis finds its way to competitors, federal regulators, and investigative journalists who can ensure the information is used to protect the company instead of destroying it." "Corporate jujitsu," Joshua said, understanding dawning. "Use their own momentum against them." "Precisely, but it has to look completely legitimate from their perspective, which means I need your help to access employee records, financial systems, and operational data in ways that won't trigger security alerts or raise suspicions among your colleagues." Joshua extended his hand across the cable. "Partners?" Victoria shook it, her grip firm and warm. "Partners.
But Joshua, if this goes wrong, if Kane decides that Luna represents an unacceptable risk, I need you to promise me you'll take her and disappear. I have resources that can help you establish new identities and relocate somewhere safe." "It's not going to come to that," Joshua said, with more confidence than he felt. "We're going to win this." "How can you be so sure?" Joshua thought about his daughter's innocent faith in his heroic abilities, about the community of TechFlow employees who treated their work like a calling rather than just a job, and about the fundamental difference between people who built things and people who destroyed them for profit. "Because," he said, "we're fighting for something they can't understand. They see assets and liabilities, profit margins and quarterly reports. We see families and communities and futures worth protecting. That's not just an advantage, it's everything." The abandoned Rosewood Elementary School sat on the eastern edge of Portland's industrial district, its red brick facade weathered by decades of Pacific Northwest rain and neglect. The building had been closed for 5 years due to budget cuts, but its basement computer lab still contained functional equipment that the school district had never bothered to remove, making it the perfect location for activities that required privacy and untraceable internet access. At 11:30 p.m. on a Tuesday night, 3 weeks after their coffee shop alliance, Joshua descended the school's rear fire escape with a laptop bag slung over his shoulder and a growing appreciation for just how complicated his life had become. What had started as weekend meetings in various coffee shops had evolved into late-night strategy sessions in increasingly secure locations as Victoria's paranoia about Meridian Capital's surveillance capabilities proved entirely justified. She was already there when he arrived, her silhouette visible through the basement windows illuminated by the blue glow of multiple computer screens. Over the past month, Victoria had transformed the abandoned computer lab into a sophisticated intelligence operations center, complete with encrypted communication systems, secure servers, and enough caffeine to fuel a small army. "Any problems getting here?" Victoria asked, as Joshua picked his way through the darkened hallway using his phone's flashlight. She had changed from her corporate CEO attire into dark tactical clothing that made her look more like a special operations agent than a business executive, an image that was becoming increasingly accurate as their operation expanded. "Luna's staying at her friend Emma's house for a sleepover, and I told Mrs. Patterson I was working late on a freelance project. She thinks I'm becoming dangerously obsessed with work, which isn't entirely wrong," Joshua replied, settling into the workstation Victoria had prepared for him. The basement lab hummed with electronic activity as multiple systems ran sophisticated data analysis programs Victoria had designed to map Meridian Capital's financial networks. On the main screen, a complex flowchart displayed the connections between shell companies, offshore accounts, and seemingly legitimate businesses that form the infrastructure of corporate predation. "Look at this," Victoria said, pulling up a series of financial records on her secondary monitor. "I've been analyzing the payment structures for Meridian's previous acquisitions, and I found something that changes everything. They're not just stripping assets from individual companies, they're systematically destroying entire economic ecosystems." Joshua leaned closer to study the data, his programmer's mind immediately recognizing the pattern she'd identified. These payment flows show money moving between acquired companies before they're dissolved. They're using the resources of one victim to finance the acquisition of the next target. Exactly. Look at this sequence. Victoria highlighted a series of transactions spanning 18 months. They acquired Brennan Industries, liquidated their equipment and real estate, then used those funds to finance the hostile takeover of Mountain View Technologies. When Mountain View was dismantled, the proceeds funded the acquisition of 3 smaller companies simultaneously.
Joshua felt his stomach turn as he traced the connections. It's not just corporate cannibalism, it's a feeding frenzy. Each company they destroy makes them more powerful and gives them more resources to destroy the next target. And TechFlow is next in line, Victoria confirmed, pulling up financial projections that showed her company's estimated value broken down into component parts. But here's what they don't know. I've been feeding them carefully modified information about our operational capabilities and market position. She opened a series of documents that appeared to be standard corporate analysis reports, the kind of detailed financial assessments that acquisition specialists produced to guide purchasing decisions. But as Joshua studied the data more carefully, he began to see subtle discrepancies that would be invisible to anyone who wasn't intimately familiar with TechFlow's actual operations. "You've been sabotaging your own reports," he realized, impressed, despite the seriousness of their situation. "Carefully," Victoria emphasized. "The modifications have to be sophisticated enough to avoid detection by Meridian's verification processes, but significant enough to impact their strategic planning. I've been understating our proprietary technology's market value while overstating our operational vulnerabilities and competitive threats." Joshua pulled up TechFlow's actual financial records on his laptop, comparing them to Victoria's modified versions. "You've made us look like a company in decline with outdated technology and increasing market pressures. They'll still want to acquire us, but they'll pay less and expect easier asset extraction, which gives us time and resources they won't anticipate," Victoria said, bringing up another screen showing communication intercepts from Meridian's internal systems. "But the real breakthrough came from your employee access credentials. The data you've been gathering about our colleagues' skills and project assignments has revealed something I never expected." Over the past 3 weeks, Joshua had been conducting what appeared to be routine IT security assessments, documenting employee computer usage, project assignments, and technical capabilities. To his colleagues, it looked like standard corporate bureaucracy, the kind of data gathering that IT departments performed regularly to optimize system performance and resource allocation. What he'd actually been doing was creating a comprehensive inventory of TechFlow's human resources that went far beyond official job descriptions and organizational charts. The results had surprised both of them. "Sarah Kim in accounting isn't just a bookkeeper," Victoria explained, pulling up employee profiles they'd compiled. "She has an MBA in international finance and spent 5 years as a forensic accountant for the IRS before she decided she wanted work-life balance. James Rodriguez from the marketing department has a background in investigative journalism and still maintains contacts at major news outlets. Maria Thompson from Human Resources used to work for the Department of Labor investigating corporate compliance violations." Joshua studied the profiles, seeing TechFlow's employees in an entirely new light. "Half our workforce has skills and experience that could be incredibly valuable in fighting corporate fraud, but they're working in positions that don't utilize those capabilities because they chose family and community over career advancement," Victoria said quietly. "They took jobs that let them live in Portland, send their kids to good schools, and maintain healthy relationships, even if it meant not maximizing their professional potential. Meridian Capital sees that as weakness, people who've settled for less than they could achieve. But you see it as strength?" Victoria's expression grew thoughtful as she considered the question. "I see it as something I never learned to value until recently. For 10 years, I measured success by salary increases, corner offices, and the respect of people whose approval meant advancement opportunities. I moved to new cities whenever better positions became available, ended relationships that might interfere with career goals, and defined myself entirely through professional achievements." She gestured toward the employee profiles displayed across multiple screens. "These people made different choices. They prioritized stability over advancement, community over competition, and relationships over recognition. What I initially saw as lack of ambition, I now recognize as wisdom." Joshua thought about his own career decisions since Luna was born, about the corporate opportunities he declined because they required relocation or excessive travel, about the freelance projects he'd taken to supplement their income without disrupting their family routine. Sometimes the most important victories are the ones that don't appear on any resume. Exactly. And that's why Meridian Capital's strategy will fail. Victoria pulled up a new set of documents.
Their entire approach depends on the assumption that employees are interchangeable resources who will passively accept layoffs and restructuring because they have no other options. They've never encountered a workforce with this combination of specialized skills, community ties, and shared investment in protecting their collective future. Over the past month, Victoria had been conducting what appeared to be routine employee evaluations and strategic planning sessions. In reality, she'd been carefully assessing which TechFlow employees could be trusted with sensitive information and which possessed skills that could be valuable in their resistance efforts. The results had given them something neither had expected: a potential network of allies with diverse expertise and shared motivation.
The question is how we activate that network without exposing them to retaliation, Joshua said, studying communication logs that showed increased security monitoring of TechFlow's systems. Meridian is definitely watching more closely now. Their IT intrusions are becoming more sophisticated. Victoria nodded, pulling up security reports that documented multiple attempts to breach TechFlow's internal systems. Vincent Kane's people are trying to access employee records, financial data, and project files. They want independent verification of my reports, which means our deception has a limited lifespan. How long do we have? 6 weeks, maybe 8 if we're lucky, Victoria estimated. After that, they'll either detect the inconsistencies in my analysis or decide to proceed with acquisition based on the information they've already gathered. Either way, we need to be ready to implement the final phase of our strategy. Joshua saved his work and began shutting down the systems they'd been using. Which brings us to the big question: how do we transition from gathering intelligence to taking action without getting everyone killed? Victoria was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the keyboard as she considered the enormity of what they were attempting. By giving them exactly what they want, a detailed plan for TechFlow's destruction, while simultaneously ensuring that plan becomes the blueprint for their own downfall. As they prepared to leave the abandoned school, Joshua felt the weight of responsibility settling more heavily on his shoulders. What had begun as a desperate attempt to protect his daughter had evolved into something much larger: a battle for the survival of communities like TechFlow, where people chose human connections over corporate advancement, where success was measured in shared prosperity rather than individual achievement. "Victoria," he said as they reached the fire escape, "when this is over, assuming we survive and win, what happens to us, to this partnership we've built?" She paused on the metal steps, her face illuminated by the industrial lights of Portland's skyline. "I don't know," she admitted. "For the first time in my adult life, I'm not planning 3 career moves ahead or calculating the optimal path to the next promotion. I'm just trying to protect something worth preserving." "And after that?" Victoria smiled, and for a moment she looked less like a corporate executive and more like someone who was learning to value things that couldn't be quantified in quarterly reports. "Maybe I'll learn what it means to choose community over advancement, relationships over recognition. Maybe I'll discover what your TechFlow colleagues already know about building a life worth living." As they parted ways in the empty parking lot, Victoria returning to her downtown apartment, Joshua heading home to relieve Mrs. Patterson and check on Luna, both carried the knowledge that their alliance had evolved beyond mere survival strategy. They were fighting not just against Meridian Capital, but for a vision of the future where corporate power served human communities rather than consuming them. The countdown to confrontation had begun, and neither of them could predict whether their careful plans would be sufficient to protect everyone they'd come to care about. The TechFlow parking garage at 6:15 a.m. was usually empty, except for the handful of early arrivals who used the quiet morning hours to catch up on projects without interruption. Joshua had developed this routine over the past month,
arriving early to conduct his security assessments without drawing attention from colleagues who might ask uncomfortable questions about his sudden interest in company data systems. What he hadn't expected was to find Dave Rodriguez waiting by his car, holding a manila folder and wearing the expression of someone who'd been awake most of the night, wrestling with difficult decisions. "We need to talk," Dave said, without preamble, his usual friendly demeanor replaced by something harder and more determined. "About what you and Victoria Ashford have been really doing after hours." Joshua's blood turned cold as he realized their careful operational security had been compromised. Dave had been his supervisor for 3 years, had recommended him for salary increases, had covered for him during the worst days after Elena left, when single parenthood had made regular schedules impossible. He was also one of the most observant people Joshua had ever worked with, the kind of manager who noticed when employees' behavior patterns changed even slightly. "I don't know what you mean," Joshua said carefully, buying time while his mind raced through damage control scenarios. Dave opened the folder and spread its contents across the hood of Joshua's aging Honda Civic. Security camera screenshots showed Joshua and Victoria entering the abandoned Rosewood Elementary School on 3 separate nights. Financial records detailed anomalies in Victoria's acquisition reports that wouldn't be visible to casual observers, but were glaring obvious to someone with Dave's analytical background. Email logs showed encrypted communications between Victoria's corporate account and external addresses that had no apparent business purpose.
"I've been watching both of you for 2 weeks," Dave said quietly. "Victoria's behavioral patterns don't match any corporate executive I've ever encountered, and your sudden interest in employee data analysis coincided suspiciously with her arrival. Either you're conducting an affair that requires military-grade operational security, or you're involved in something that puts this entire company at risk." Joshua studied his supervisor's face, searching for signs of hostility or betrayal. What he found instead was concern mixed with determination, the expression of someone who discovered a potential threat to people he cared about and wasn't willing to ignore it. "How long have you known?" Joshua asked, abandoning any pretense of innocence. "I started suspecting something the day after Victoria's first company meeting," Dave replied, collecting the documents from the car hood. "Her presentation was too polished, too specific about our operations for someone who'd supposedly been brought in as an external CEO. She knew details about employee performance, project timelines, and system capabilities that weren't in any of the briefing materials Harold provided." Dave pulled out his phone and showed Joshua a series of screenshots from Victoria's corporate background verification. "So I did some research. Victoria Ashford's professional history is impressive but incomplete. 3 different companies she supposedly worked for have no record of her employment during the specified periods. Her educational credentials check out, but her work experience has gaps that suggest either witness protection or deep cover corporate espionage." "And you concluded what, exactly?" "That either she's a corporate spy sent to gather intelligence for a hostile takeover, or she's something else entirely that requires this level of operational secrecy," Dave said. "Given your involvement and the obvious care you're both taking to avoid detection, I'm hoping it's the latter." Joshua leaned against his car, feeling the weight of decisions that would affect not just his family, but potentially everyone he worked with. Dave had been a good supervisor and a decent friend, but trusting him with the truth about Meridian Capital would put him in danger from people who viewed collateral damage as acceptable business costs. "If I tell you what's really happening," Joshua said slowly, "you become a target. These aren't corporate executives playing political games. They're people who arrange accidents for anyone who threatens their operations." Dave's expression hardened. The brake failure that brought Victoria to Portland wasn't an accident, was it? No. And the surveillance photos they have of Luna walking to school weren't taken by private investigators conducting routine background checks. I made his decision, realizing that Dave's analytical skills and insider knowledge could be invaluable if he was willing to accept the risks. Victoria isn't here to destroy TechFlow. She's here to save it from people who arranged her murder to prevent her from exposing their operations. Over the next 30 minutes, Joshua provided Dave with an abbreviated version of the conspiracy they'd uncovered. Meridian Capital's systematic destruction of mid-sized companies, Victoria's role as their former acquisition specialist, her moral awakening after the Brennan Industries operation, and the evidence they'd been gathering to expose the entire network. Dave listened without interruption, his programmer's mind processing the information with the same methodical approach he brought to debugging complex software problems. When Joshua finished, Dave was quiet for several minutes, staring through the parking garage's concrete pillars toward the Portland skyline, where glass towers reflected the early morning sun. "Show me the evidence," Dave said finally. They drove to the abandoned Rosewood Elementary in Dave's car, Joshua directing them through surface streets while mentally calculating how many people now knew about their operation, and how that knowledge multiplied their vulnerability to discovery. The basement computer lab looked different in daylight, filtering through dirty windows, less like a sophisticated intelligence center, more like what it actually was, a forgotten room full of obsolete equipment that had been repurposed by desperate people fighting battles they couldn't afford to lose. Victoria arrived 20 minutes later, her professional composure cracking when she saw Dave examining their surveillance setup and document analysis systems. "You told him," she said to Joshua, her voice carrying equal measures of accusation and resignation. "He already knew," Joshua replied. "The question is whether we trust him with the rest of it." Victoria studied Dave with the same analytical intensity she brought to corporate assessments, reading his body language and facial expressions for signs of deception or hidden agendas. "What do you want?" she asked finally. "To understand whether the people I supervise are heroes or criminals, and to decide whether TechFlow's employees deserve to know that their livelihoods are at stake." Victoria activated the main display screen, showing Dave the financial networks they'd mapped, the communication intercepts they'd decoded, and the evidence they'd compiled of Meridian Capital's illegal activities. She walked him through their deception strategy, explaining how she'd been feeding Meridian modified information while gathering evidence of their broader operations. The timeline for final action is accelerating. Meridian's board is pressuring for faster acquisition completion, and Vincent Kane's surveillance teams are asking more detailed questions about potential security risks. We have maybe 3 weeks before they either detect our deception or decide to proceed based on incomplete information. Dave studied the evidence with the same focused attention he'd shown during their most complex programming projects. "You're not just fighting to save TechFlow," he observed. "You're trying to dismantle an entire corporate predation network that threatens every mid-sized company in the Pacific Northwest." "And probably beyond," Victoria confirmed. "Meridian Capital has expansion plans that target markets throughout the West Coast. TechFlow is just their current focus. If we don't stop them here, they'll use our resources to fund attacks on dozens of other communities." "Which brings us to the central problem," Joshua interjected, pulling up employee profiles they'd compiled. "We can't protect TechFlow's employees without their knowledge and cooperation, but we can't inform them without exposing them to retaliation from people who specialize in making problems disappear permanently." Dave was quiet for several minutes, processing implications that went far beyond their individual company or careers. "How many of our colleagues have the skills necessary to contribute to this fight?" Victoria showed him the assessment they'd completed over the past month.
More than half the workforce has experience or capabilities that could be valuable in exposing corporate fraud, but most of them chose TechFlow specifically to avoid the kind of high-stakes conflicts that define corporate warfare. They chose community over competition, Dave said, echoing the conversations Joshua and Victoria had been having about their colleagues' priorities. Family stability over career advancement, which makes them either perfect allies or completely unsuitable for what we're asking them to risk, Joshua said. The question is how we find out which category they fall into without putting them in danger just by asking. Dave walked to the basement windows, looking out at the industrial landscape that surrounded the abandoned school. Portland's combination of urban development and natural beauty had always attracted people who wanted professional opportunities without sacrificing quality of life, exactly the kind of employees that formed TechFlow's workforce. "There's something you both need to know," Dave said, turning back to face them. "I'm not the only person who's been noticing unusual activity. Sarah Kim in accounting has been asking questions about budget anomalies that coincide with Victoria's arrival. James Thompson in marketing has been researching corporate acquisition patterns that match our recent operational changes. Maria Rodriguez from HR has been quietly documenting policy modifications that suggest preparation for workforce restructuring." Victoria felt her carefully constructed operational security crumbling around her. "How many people suspect something?" "At least a dozen, possibly more," Dave admitted. "TechQuo employees aren't naive about corporate politics. Most of us have worked for larger companies where acquisition rumors preceded massive layoffs. The signs you've been trying to hide are actually quite obvious to people who've seen this process before." Joshua realized that their attempts to protect their colleagues by keeping them uninformed had actually created more suspicion and anxiety than honest communication might have generated. They think Victoria is here to prepare us for acquisition and layoffs, which, from their perspective, is exactly what's happening. The difference is that you're trying to prevent the outcome instead of facilitate it, but they have no way of knowing that. Victoria sat down heavily in one of the computer lab's old chairs, the weight of unintended consequences adding to the pressure she'd been carrying for months. "I've been so focused on protecting them from Meridian Capital that I never considered how my deception would affect their daily lives and job security concerns." "So what do we do?" Joshua asked, looking between his supervisor and his unlikely partner. "Tell them the truth and hope they're willing to fight, or maintain operational security and hope our plan succeeds before their suspicions create bigger problems?" Dave pulled out his phone and showed them a group text thread that had been active since early morning. "I think that decision has been made for us," he said. "The TechFlow employees have called an emergency meeting for this afternoon. They want answers about company direction, job security, and why their new CEO seems to be conducting corporate espionage after hours." Victoria read the text messages, seeing her carefully planned timeline collapsing into chaos. "How many people know about this meeting?" "Everyone," Dave replied, "and they've specifically requested that you and Joshua attend to answer questions about unusual recent activities and concerns about company stability." Joshua felt the familiar weight of protecting Luna's future, but now it was multiplied by responsibility for 30 families that depended on TechFlow for their livelihoods. "We're out of time for careful planning and gradual trust building."
"Yes," Victoria said, her strategic mind already adapting to the new reality. "Which means we tell them everything this afternoon and hope that people who chose community over advancement are willing to fight to protect both." The abandoned school basement fell silent, except for the hum of computers processing data that might soon determine the fate of everyone they cared about. Outside, Portland continued its daily rhythm, unaware that in a forgotten room full of old equipment, 3 people were preparing to wage war against forces that viewed human communities as obstacles to profit maximization. The careful deception was over. Tomorrow would bring either victory or destruction, and there was no longer any middle ground between them. The TechFlow break room had never been designed to accommodate 37 people engaged in what amounted to corporate warfare planning. But at 4:30 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon, it was serving exactly that purpose. Every chair from the office had been commandeered, leaving half the employees standing against walls or perched on desks while Victoria faced the most hostile audience of her professional career. She'd expected anger and suspicion when Joshua introduced her as a former Meridian Capital acquisition specialist who'd been sent to destroy their company. What she hadn't anticipated was the grim determination that settled over the room as employees absorbed the implications of what they were facing. "So, let me understand this correctly," said Sarah Kim, her accounting expertise making her the natural spokesperson for employee concerns. "Meridian Capital tried to kill you to prevent you from exposing their illegal operations, and when that failed, they're using threats against Joshua's daughter to force your compliance with a hostile takeover that will destroy our jobs and livelihoods?" "That's correct," Victoria replied, her usual corporate confidence replaced by something raw and more honest. "And now that I've told you the truth, you're all potential targets if Vincent Kane decides that eliminating witnesses is more efficient than managing them." A murmur of concerned conversation rippled through the break room as employees processed the reality that their workplace drama had escalated into actual physical danger. James Thompson, whose investigative journalism background had made him naturally suspicious of Victoria's arrival, raised his hand. "What kind of timeline are we looking at? How long before Kane's people realize their corporate puppet has gone rogue?" Victoria consulted her phone, where encrypted messages from her federal contact painted an increasingly urgent picture. "Based on surveillance detection and communication intercepts, we have maybe 72 hours before Meridian's board loses patience with the delays and authorizes more direct action." "Direct action, meaning what exactly?" asked Maria Rodriguez from her position near the coffee machine, her Department of Labor background making her naturally focused on employee protection issues. Joshua answered before Victoria could soften the reality. "Meaning they'll either force the acquisition through legal channels while eliminating anyone who might interfere, or they'll arrange accidents for key personnel and present the company's distressed situation as justification for emergency asset liquidation." The break room fell silent as 37 people contemplated the possibility that their choice was between fighting corporate criminals or accepting the destruction of everything they'd built together. Outside the windows, Portland's Thursday afternoon traffic moved through intersections where normal people dealt with normal problems, mortgage payments and parent-teacher conferences and grocery shopping, problems that seemed impossibly simple compared to the decision facing TechFlow's employees. "What do we need from you?" asked Dave Rodriguez, speaking for the group with the authority of someone who'd earned their respect through 3 years of fair supervision and honest leadership. Victoria pulled out her laptop and connected it to the break room's wall-mounted monitor, displaying a presentation she'd prepared during lunch while Joshua handled damage control with employees who'd been asking increasingly pointed questions about recent changes in company operations. She clicked to a slide that showed Meridian Capital's organizational structure. "We need 3 things," she began, clicking to a slide that showed Meridian Capital's organizational structure. "First, we need documentation specialists to help compile evidence that federal investigators can use to build criminal cases against Meridian's entire network. Second, we need technical experts to help expose their illegal surveillance and hacking operations. Third, we need strategic coordinators to help implement a defense plan that protects this company while ensuring Meridian Capital's other potential victims receive early warning about their tactics." She clicked to the next slide, showing a timeline that stretched over the next month. "But most importantly, we need people who are willing to accept significant personal risk to protect something larger than their individual job security." Tommy Chen, a software developer who'd been quiet during most of the discussion, stood up near the back of the room. "My parents lost their restaurant to a corporate buyout when I was in high school. Investors convinced them to sell by promising to maintain the family recipes and keep the staff. Within 6 months, they'd fired everyone and turned it into a chain location that served frozen food with no connection to what my family had built." He looked around the room at colleagues who'd become extended family over the years of shared projects and mutual support. "I didn't understand then that fighting back was possible.
I thought corporate power was something ordinary people had to accept. But I'm not a kid anymore, and TechFlow isn't just my job, it's our community." His words seemed to crystallize something in the room's atmosphere. Other employees began sharing their own stories of corporate betrayal and economic displacement that had led them to seek the stability and mutual respect that TechFlow represented. Victoria listened to accounts of layoffs that destroyed families, restructuring that eliminated benefits, and acquisition processes that turned thriving companies into corporate graveyards. "The question isn't whether we fight," said Linda Park, whose quality assurance expertise had made her naturally suspicious of systems that didn't work as advertised. "The question is whether we can win." Victoria clicked to a slide showing the federal investigation network she'd been building over the past 4 months. "We are not fighting alone. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit has been building cases against corporate acquisition fraud for 2 years, but they've needed evidence that could only come from inside the operations. Securities and Exchange Commission investigators have been tracking suspicious trading patterns that correlate with Meridian's activities. Department of Justice attorneys have been waiting for witnesses who could testify about systematic corporate predation." She showed them communication logs that revealed the scope of law enforcement interest in Meridian Capital. "What we're offering them isn't just evidence about TechFlow's situation, it's the cornerstone testimony that could dismantle an entire network of corporate criminals who've been operating with impunity for years." "And if we fail?" asked Robert Kim, whose human resources background made him naturally focused on worst-case scenario planning. "If we fail," Victoria said quietly, "Meridian Capital continues expanding their operations throughout the Pacific Northwest, destroying communities like yours and using the profits to fund even larger acquisition campaigns. Within 5 years, they'll control enough market share to influence state legislation and federal policy. The kind of corporate predation that destroyed your parents' restaurant becomes the standard business model for an entire economic sector." Joshua stood up from his position near the door, where he'd been monitoring hallway activity for signs of unexpected visitors. "There's something else everyone needs to understand. Once you commit to this fight, you can't change your minds if things get dangerous. Vincent Kane's people don't distinguish between active resistance and passive knowledge. Anyone who knows about our operations becomes a potential security risk." The weight of that statement settled over the room like a physical presence. These were people who'd chosen TechFlow specifically to avoid high-stakes corporate warfare, who'd prioritized family stability over career advancement, who'd built their lives around the assumption that honest work and mutual respect would be sufficient to ensure their security. "How do we protect our families?" asked Jennifer Wu, whose 2 young children attended the same elementary school as Luna. "If these people are willing to threaten an 8-year-old girl to maintain their leverage, what's to stop them from escalating to direct action against anyone who opposes them?" Victoria had been dreading this question because the honest answer revealed the full scope of what she was asking from people who'd never signed up for corporate espionage. "We implement a community protection protocol," she said, clicking to a slide that showed safe house locations and emergency communication procedures. "I have resources that can provide temporary relocation for families if Kane's surveillance teams identify them as specific targets. But the safest strategy is to move fast enough that Meridian Capital doesn't have time to implement retaliation protocols." "Meaning we have to expose them before they realize we're a threat," Dave summarized, his programmer's mind automatically identifying the logical constraints of their situation. "Exactly, which brings us to the immediate operational requirements," Victoria said, advancing to slides that showed specific assignments and timelines. "We need to compile evidence, coordinate with federal investigators, and expose Meridian's operations simultaneously across multiple channels before they can implement damage control or witness elimination protocols." Sarah Kim raised her hand again. "What happens to TechFlow if we succeed? Even if we stop Meridian Capital, we've still got a company that's been operating under false pretenses with a CEO who was originally sent here to destroy us." Victoria had been preparing for this question since the moment she decided to reveal the truth to TechFlow's employees. If we succeed, TechFlow becomes employee-owned through a cooperative structure that eliminates the possibility of future hostile takeovers. The intellectual property you've developed remains under your collective control, and the profits from your innovations benefit the people who created them rather than external investors. She clicked to a final slide showing financial projections that transform TechFlow from a traditional corporation into a worker-owned cooperative. I forfeit my executive position and accept whatever the employee owners decide is appropriate for someone with my background and skills. My corporate experience becomes a resource for protecting your community rather than exploiting it. The break room buzzed with quiet conversations as employees absorbed the implications of employee ownership and democratic workplace governance. For people who'd spent their careers as labor resources hired by capital investors, the concept of owning their own productive capacity represented a fundamental shift in economic power. "All in favor?" Dave asked, calling for a voice vote that would commit every person in the room to a course of action with potentially life-altering consequences. The response was unanimous and immediate. "Aye."
Victoria felt something break open in her chest as she realized that 37 people had just chosen to trust her with their livelihoods, their family's security, and their community's future. For the first time in her professional life, she was part of something larger than quarterly profits and competitive advantage. She was part of a group that chose mutual protection over individual advancement. "We start tonight," she announced, feeling the weight and exhilaration of shared purpose. "Meridian Capital expects their next progress report by Monday morning. Instead, they're going to receive the surprise of their corporate lives." Outside, Portland's evening rush hour carried normal people toward normal homes where they would eat normal dinners and worry about normal problems. Inside TechFlow's break room, 37 people began planning a war against forces that treated human communities as expendable resources and the endless pursuit of capital accumulation. The battle for their future had officially begun. The secure communication hub that TechFlow's break room had become over the past 18 hours bore no resemblance to the casual space where employees had once microwaved lunches and complained about Portland's perpetual drizzle. Banks of laptops formed workstations along every available surface. Encrypted phones buzzed with updates from federal investigators, and a sophisticated document analysis system had transformed the corner near the windows into something resembling a war room. At 2:17 a.m. on Friday morning, Victoria stood before a wall-mounted monitor displaying real-time financial transactions as Meridian Capital's automated systems moved money between shell companies, unaware that every transfer was being documented by people they'd dismissed as expendable corporate resources. The past day had revealed capabilities within TechFlow's workforce that would have impressed intelligence agencies, as employees who'd chosen family-friendly careers demonstrated skills that corporate headhunters would have paid fortunes to acquire. "Sarah's forensic accounting background is a goldmine," reported James Thompson, whose investigative journalism contacts had provided secure communication channels with reporters at The Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and Seattle Times. "She's identified transaction patterns that prove systematic coordination between Meridian's supposedly independent subsidiary companies. We're not just looking at corporate fraud, we're documenting racketeering on a scale that crosses state lines." Victoria nodded, feeling the exhaustion that came from 20 hours of sustained strategic planning, but also an energy she'd never experienced during her years as a corporate predator. Maria's Department of Labor expertise has been equally valuable. She's documented labor law violations in 17 states where Meridian operated acquisition campaigns. The evidence suggests they've been using the same playbook to destroy employee protections and community stability for at least 5 years. The break room's central table had been converted into a command center, where Dave Rodriguez coordinated technical operations with the precision of someone managing a software development project with life-or-death stakes.
Multiple screens showed surveillance feeds from around TechFlow's building, encrypted communication logs with federal investigators, and a sophisticated document analysis system had transformed the corner near the windows into something resembling a war room. Joshua's military engineering background has been crucial for security protocols, Dave reported, indicating motion sensors and early warning systems that had been improvised using office equipment and consumer electronics. We've got perimeter monitoring that would alert us to surveillance teams or direct assault preparations, plus communication redundancies that ensure our evidence reaches federal investigators even if Kane's people try to shut us down physically. The most remarkable transformation had been watching Robert Kim, whose quiet human resources demeanor concealed strategic planning capabilities that belonged in corporate boardrooms or military operations centers. He'd spent the night developing contingency protocols for every possible escalation scenario, from legal intimidation to physical threats against employee families. Family protection protocols are operational, Robert announced, consulting charts that track the locations and security status of every TechFlow employee's dependents. Luna is secure at the Rodriguez family's cabin on Mount Hood with 3 other employee children and 2 off-duty Portland police officers who volunteer with the community emergency response team. All elderly relatives have been relocated to temporary housing with neighbors who understand the situation. We've got emergency communication trees that can activate evacuation procedures within 15 minutes if Kane's surveillance escalates to direct action. Victoria felt a surge of gratitude toward people who'd accepted responsibility for Luna's safety without being asked, who'd opened their homes to strangers' children and elderly relatives because protecting the community meant protecting everyone in it. The corporate world she had inhabited for 10 years had operated on principles of individual competition and strategic advantage. But TechFlow's employees were demonstrating something entirely different: collective security based on mutual aid and shared risk. "What's our timeline for evidence compilation?" she asked, checking encrypted messages from her federal contact that painted an increasingly urgent picture. Tommy Chen looked up from his workstation, where he'd been coordinating with Securities and Exchange Commission investigators who'd been tracking Meridian's trading patterns for months. "We've got enough evidence to support criminal indictments against Rothwell, Cross, and Kane individually, plus conspiracy charges that could dismantle their entire network. But the federal prosecutors want more time to coordinate simultaneous arrests that prevent any of them from fleeing to non-extradition countries." "How much more time?" 72 hours for complete legal preparation, 48 hours for basic indictments that might not stick in court. But there's a complication we didn't anticipate. He pulled up communication intercepts that showed Meridian Capital's board was becoming suspicious about delays in Victoria's progress reports. They're planning to send a direct oversight team to Portland this afternoon. Kane himself, plus 2 operational specialists who handle problematic acquisitions that require personal attention. The break room fell silent as 37 people absorbed the implication that their careful intelligence gathering had triggered exactly the kind of direct intervention they'd hoped to avoid. Kane's reputation for solving problems through permanent elimination of inconvenient people meant that his personal involvement escalated their situation from corporate espionage to something approaching urban warfare. "We're out of time for gradual evidence compilation," Victoria announced, her strategic mind adapting to circumstances that no business school had prepared her to handle. "Which means we implement the emergency exposure protocol and hope that public attention provides enough protection to keep Kane from using his preferred problem-solving methods." Jennifer Wu, whose children are now safely protected at the Mount Hood cabin, raised her hand from her position near the coffee station. "What exactly does emergency exposure protocol mean?" Victoria clicked to a presentation slide showing coordinated media release schedules. "We release everything simultaneously across multiple channels before Kane arrives in Portland. Financial evidence goes to federal investigators and financial reporters. Corporate surveillance documentation goes to privacy advocacy groups and technology journalists. Personal testimony about intimidation and threats goes to human rights organizations and local news outlets." She advanced to the next slide, showing a timeline compressed from weeks to hours.
James coordinates with his journalism contacts to ensure stories published simultaneously in major newspapers. Sarah and Maria provide technical analysis to federal investigators who can begin moving on arrest warrants. Tommy and Robert handle local media coordination to ensure Portland's business community understands what's been happening. And if Kane decides that eliminating witnesses is more efficient than legal damage control? Asked Linda Park, her quality assurance background making her naturally focused on failure modes and disaster recovery. Joshua answered from his position monitoring the security feeds. Then we've got documentation proving that a known corporate enforcer threatened specific individuals in connection with a federal criminal investigation. Kane's power depends on operating in shadows. Once his methods become public knowledge, he becomes a liability rather than an asset. Victoria felt her phone buzzing with encrypted messages that painted an increasingly urgent picture. Federal investigators are ready to coordinate arrests, but they need our evidence uploaded to secure servers within the next 6 hours. Once Kane arrives in Portland, any delay in legal action gives him opportunities to implement the kind of permanent solutions he specializes in. The break room buzzed with focused activity as employees who'd spent years developing software began applying those same systematic problem-solving skills to exposing corporate corruption. Code reviews became evidence verification protocols. Quality assurance testing became fact-checking procedures. Project management became coordinated resistance operations. Maria's got labor law documentation ready for Department of Justice attorneys, reported Dave, monitoring multiple communication channels simultaneously. Sarah's financial analysis is formatted for both FBI investigators and Securities and Exchange Commission enforcement teams. James has confirmed publication schedules with reporters in 5 major cities. Victoria watched her phone display countdown timers that marked hours remaining before Kane's arrival and federal arrest operations. Robert, what's the status on family protection? All dependents are secure and accounted for, Robert replied, consulting his charts with military precision. Emergency communication protocols are active. Evacuation routes are confirmed. Local law enforcement has been briefed on potential security concerns without compromising operational details. The transformation of TechFlow's employees from passive victims to active resistance fighters had happened so quickly that Victoria was still processing the implications. These were people who'd chosen careers that prioritized work-life balance over corporate advancement, who had accepted lower salaries in exchange for community stability, who'd built their lives around the assumption that honest work and mutual respect would ensure their security. But when that security was threatened, they demonstrated capabilities that professional intelligence operatives would have envied. More importantly, they'd shown something that her corporate world had never valued: the willingness to accept personal risk to protect collective well-being. Upload protocols are ready, announced Tommy, his fingers hovering over encryption keys that would send months of evidence to federal investigators simultaneously. Once I hit this button, there's no going back. Meridian Capital will know within hours that their operations have been completely exposed. Victoria looked around the break room at faces that showed exhaustion and determination in equal measure. 37 people who'd never expected their software development jobs to require skills in corporate espionage, federal evidence coordination, and community defense operations. People who'd chosen TechFlow because it represented stability and mutual respect, now risking everything to protect those same values. Any final questions or concerns? She asked, giving everyone a last opportunity to reconsider their commitment before crossing a line that would change all their lives permanently.
The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with shared understanding about what they were about to attempt and why it mattered beyond their individual careers or company's survival. They were fighting for the principle that human communities should serve people rather than profit margins, that corporate power should build rather than destroy, that ordinary people had the right to protect themselves against predation disguised as business strategy. Execute the protocol, Victoria ordered. Tommy's fingers moved across the keyboard with programmer's precision, uploading terabytes of evidence to secure federal servers, while simultaneously triggering coordinated media releases across the Pacific Northwest. Within minutes, their months of careful intelligence gathering would become public knowledge, and Meridian Capital's shadowy operations would face the kind of scrutiny that corporate predators couldn't survive. Outside, Portland slept peacefully, unaware that in a converted break room, 37 software developers had just declared war against forces that measured success in destroyed communities and eliminated competition. The battle that would determine whether corporate predation or community cooperation shaped their economic future had officially begun. Kane's plane was scheduled to land in 6 hours. Federal arrest teams were moving into position, and in TechFlow's break room, people who'd chosen love over profit were about to discover whether that choice was powerful enough to change the world. The Portland International Airport's private aviation terminal at 3:47 p.m. on Friday afternoon was typically quiet, serving corporate executives and wealthy travelers who preferred to avoid commercial airline crowds. Vincent Kane emerged from his chartered Gulfstream with the measured confidence of someone accustomed to solving problems that conventional business methods couldn't address, followed by 2 associates whose expensive suits couldn't quite conceal the purposeful movements of men trained in violence. What Kane didn't expect was the reception committee waiting in the terminal. 12 FBI agents, 4 Securities and Exchange Commission investigators, 3 Department of Justice attorneys, and a federal judge with arrest warrants that had been signed less than an hour earlier. "Vincent Kane," announced Special Agent Rebecca Torres, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent 6 months building cases against corporate predators like Meridian Capital. "You are under arrest for conspiracy, racketeering, money laundering, and violation of federal laws governing corporate acquisitions. You have the right to remain silent." 2 miles away, in TechFlow's break room that had become an impromptu command center, 37 employees watched live news feeds on multiple screens as simultaneous arrests unfolded across the Pacific Northwest. Marcus Rothwell was being led from his Seattle penthouse in handcuffs while reporters shouted questions about Meridian Capital's illegal operations. Damian Cross had been arrested at a Vancouver restaurant where he'd been meeting with potential investors, his boyish face now pale with shock as federal agents explained the charges against him. "It's working," breathed Sarah Kim, monitoring financial news networks that were broadcasting emergency reports about the collapse of one of the region's most aggressive acquisition firms. Stock prices for companies Meridian was targeting are already recovering. The market is responding to evidence that the takeover threats were based on fraudulent manipulation. Victoria stood at the center of the controlled chaos, coordinating with federal investigators through encrypted communication channels, while media outlets across the country published simultaneous exposés of corporate predation that reached far beyond TechFlow's specific situation. The evidence they'd compiled over months of careful intelligence gathering was being transformed into criminal prosecutions that would reshape how acquisition firms operated throughout the United States. "CNN is leading with our story," reported James Thompson, whose journalism contacts had ensured maximum coverage of Meridian Capital's systematic destruction of family-owned businesses. The Wall Street Journal's financial analysis is highlighting the racketeering aspects. Local stations are focusing on community impact and employee protection. Her phone rang with a distinctive tone that indicated her federal contact was calling with updates. "Torres here," came the familiar voice of the FBI agent who'd been coordinating their evidence uploads. "Kane, Rothwell, and Cross are in federal custody. We've got simultaneous raids happening at Meridian offices in 12 cities. Early estimates suggest we're looking at criminal conspiracy charges that could dismantle their entire network." Victoria felt something release in her chest that she'd been carrying from the night her Mercedes crashed on a rain-soaked Portland street. For months, she'd lived with the knowledge that refusing to cooperate with corporate predators might result in her death, Luna's endangerment, and the destruction of communities like TechFlow. Now, watching federal agents systematically arrest the people who'd threatened everything she'd learned to value, she finally understood what victory felt like. "What about Meridian's other targets?" she asked, thinking about companies across the Pacific Northwest that had been marked for acquisition and asset stripping. "We're coordinating with state attorneys general to provide early warning to 23 companies that were identified in Meridian's internal documents. Your evidence included enough operational detail to prevent most of their planned acquisitions, plus financial documentation that will help other communities build legal defenses against similar predation schemes."
The break room erupted in quiet celebration as employees absorbed the reality that their resistance efforts had succeeded beyond their most optimistic projections. They'd not only saved TechFlow, but potentially protected dozens of other communities from the kind of corporate destruction that had motivated their fight. Dave Rodriguez approached Victoria with printouts of news reports that were already analyzing the broader implications of Meridian Capital's exposure. The Department of Justice is announcing new federal guidelines for monitoring acquisition firms that target community-based businesses, he said, unable to suppress a grin. They're calling it the TechFlow Protocol for protecting employee-owned enterprises from predatory capitalism. Victoria read through the policy announcements, recognizing language that had been adapted from the employee ownership proposals she had developed during their months of planning. The federal government was essentially institutionalizing protections for the kind of cooperative business structure that TechFlow was preparing to implement. Speaking of employee ownership, said Robert Kim, consulting charts that showed the legal transition process they'd been preparing, we've got approval from the State Corporate Commission for TechFlow's conversion to worker cooperative status. The intellectual property transfers are complete, the profit-sharing structure is operational, and the democratic governance protocols are ready for implementation. Joshua emerged from the security monitoring station where he'd been coordinating with Mount Hood protection teams about family safety protocols. Luna and the other children are secure, he announced, his relief evident as he realized his daughter was no longer a target for corporate enforcers. Federal agents have confirmed that Kane's operational teams have been arrested and that surveillance of employee families has been terminated. The break room's atmosphere shifted from crisis management to something approaching celebration, as people who'd spent months living with the threat of corporate retaliation finally felt safe enough to consider their victory. But Victoria was already thinking about implications that extended far beyond their immediate situation. "We've got a choice to make," she announced, pulling up presentation slides that showed expansion possibilities for their cooperative model. "We can return to normal software development now that the threat has passed, or we can use what we've learned to help other communities build defenses against corporate predation." She clicked to slides showing inquiries they'd received from companies across the Pacific Northwest that were facing acquisition threats similar to what TechFlow had experienced. "In the past 24 hours, we've been contacted by 17 businesses that want consultation on conversion to employee ownership structures. 8 communities have requested assistance with identifying and exposing acquisition firms that are targeting their local economies." Dave Rodriguez studied the expansion proposals with his natural project management instincts. "You're talking about transforming TechFlow from a software development company into a consulting firm that specializes in corporate defense and community protection. I'm talking about using our skills and experience to prevent other families from facing what we've been through. About ensuring that Luna grows up in a world where corporate power serves human communities rather than consuming them." The room fell quiet as 37 people contemplated the possibility that their successful resistance against Meridian Capital could become a template for communities throughout the country. They'd proven that employee ownership could protect against hostile takeovers, that cooperative governance could make better strategic decisions than traditional corporate hierarchies, and that ordinary people possessed capabilities that professional predators consistently underestimated. "All in favor of expanding our mission?" asked Sarah Kim, calling for the same kind of voice vote that had committed them to fighting Meridian Capital. The response was unanimous and immediate. "Aye."
Victoria felt tears threatening as she realized that people who'd risked everything to save their community were now volunteering to extend that protection to strangers facing similar threats. The corporate world she'd inhabited for 10 years had operated on principles of competitive advantage and individual advancement, but TechFlow's employees were demonstrating something entirely different: the power of collective action, motivated by mutual aid rather than profit maximization. Outside, Portland's Friday afternoon traffic carried normal people toward normal weekends, where they would deal with normal problems, unaware that in a converted break room, 37 software developers had just committed to changing how American business operated at its most fundamental level. The battle for TechFlow was over. The war for economic justice in corporate America was just beginning. Federal agents continued their coordinated operations across 12 cities, dismantling networks that had operated with impunity for years. In newsrooms from Seattle to San Francisco, journalists prepared follow-up stories about corporate predation and community resistance that would dominate business coverage for months. And then a small software company that had chosen cooperation over competition, ordinary people prepared to prove that love could indeed be more powerful than profit, that communities could be stronger than corporations, and that sometimes the most important victories were won by people who'd never intended to become heroes at all. The autumn sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of TechFlow Cooperative's new headquarters, a converted warehouse in Portland's Pearl District that housed not just their expanded software development operations, but also the Community Defense Institute, a nonprofit organization that had emerged from their successful resistance against Meridian Capital. 18 months after Vincent Kane's arrest, the space hummed with activity that would have been unimaginable during their days as a traditional corporation. Victoria Ashford Hernandez stood before a wall-mounted monitor in the main conference room, addressing a video conference that connected her with employee-owned businesses in 17 states. Her title had evolved from CEO to Cooperative Coordination Director, a position that reflected her role in helping communities transition from vulnerable corporate structures to resilient worker-owned enterprises. The transformation in her appearance was as striking as the change in her responsibilities. Gone were the sharp business suits and corporate armor, replaced with comfortable clothing that prioritized function over intimidation. The Brennan Industries conversion is proceeding ahead of schedule, she reported to cooperative leaders scattered across the Pacific Northwest. 3 months after transition to employee ownership, they're showing profit increases of 28% and employee satisfaction scores that exceed industry standards by significant margins. More importantly, they've successfully resisted 2 acquisition attempts from firms using tactics similar to Meridian Capital. Joshua entered the conference room carrying Luna's latest art project, a detailed architectural drawing of their dream house that incorporated both practical family needs and whimsical design elements that only a 9-year-old mind could envision. His role as Chief Technology Officer had expanded to include security consulting for communities facing corporate predation, but his priority remained the same: ensuring Luna could grow up in a world where cooperation overcame competition. The federal legislation passed the Senate yesterday, Joshua announced, settling into the chair beside Victoria with the casual intimacy that had developed over months of shared challenges and mutual respect. The Corporate Accountability and Community Protection Act establishes legal frameworks for employee ownership transitions and creates federal penalties for acquisition firms that target community-based businesses using fraudulent or intimidating tactics. Luna looked up from her homework station in the corner of the conference room, where she'd been working on a school presentation about community helpers. At 9, she possessed a sophisticated understanding of corporate power and community resistance that would have impressed graduate students in economics, but she expressed it with the straightforward logic that children brought to moral questions. Mrs. Patterson says the new laws mean other kids won't have to worry about bad people threatening their families because of their parents' jobs, Luna said, holding up her presentation poster that featured portraits of TechFlow employees alongside traditional community helpers like firefighters and teachers. She says we prove that regular people can fight back against bullies, even when the bullies have lots of money. Victoria felt the familiar warmth that came from Luna's unconscious acceptance of her as family, a relationship that had developed naturally over months of shared meals, homework help, and the kind of daily intimacy that created bonds deeper than legal documents. The adoption papers had been finalized 6 months earlier, making official what had become emotional reality long before. Victoria was Luna's second mother and Joshua's partner in building the kind of life that prioritized love over profit. "How many communities are we working with now?" asked Sarah Kim through the video conference connection from her office in the building's Financial Analysis Center. Her forensic accounting skills had proven invaluable in helping businesses identify acquisition threats before they became crises, and her work had been cited in federal investigations of corporate predation throughout the United States. Victoria consulted her tablet, where project management software tracked community defense initiatives across the country. 47 active conversions to employee ownership, 32 communities implementing early warning systems for corporate predation, and 18 federal criminal investigations that have resulted from evidence we've helped compile. The model is replicating faster than we anticipated. The success had been overwhelming in the best possible way. What had begun as a desperate attempt to save one small software company had evolved into a movement that challenged fundamental assumptions about corporate power and community vulnerability. Employee-owned businesses were demonstrating superior performance across multiple metrics: financial sustainability, worker satisfaction, community engagement, and resistance to predatory acquisition, while traditional corporations struggled to explain why cooperative models consistently outperformed hierarchical structures. Dave Rodriguez appeared on the monitor from his position as Director of Technical Operations, where he coordinated secure communication systems for communities facing corporate threats. The Senate subcommittee wants us to testify again next month about expansion possibilities for the Community Defense Institute. They're considering federal funding for cooperative transition assistance programs. Which brings us to the big decision we've been avoiding, Victoria said, addressing both the local team and remote participants. The Department of Justice has offered to establish community defense institutes in 12 major cities with federal funding and official law enforcement coordination. It would mean expanding from regional to national operations, but it would also mean accepting government oversight and bureaucratic constraints. The room fell quiet as people who'd learned to make decisions through democratic consensus considered implications that extended far beyond their immediate community. Federal funding would provide resources to help communities across the country, but it would also require compliance with political pressures and administrative requirements that might compromise their effectiveness. "What do you think, Luna?" Joshua asked, recognizing that his daughter's perspective often cut through complexities that adults created unnecessarily. Luna considered the question with the seriousness she brought to important family decisions. Will more kids be safe if we say yes? Probably, but we might have to follow rules that make us less effective at helping people. Will fewer kids be safe if we say no? Also, probably. We could help people faster without bureaucratic restrictions, but we couldn't help as many people without federal resources. Luna nodded thoughtfully, her 9-year-old logic addressing strategic challenges that had been troubling adults for weeks. Then we should try saying yes, and if the rules make us stop helping people, we can change back to doing it ourselves. The simplicity of her analysis highlighted something that corporate strategic planning often missed. Sometimes the best approach was to try things and adapt based on results, rather than trying to predict every possible outcome before taking action. The TechFlow Cooperative had succeeded precisely because they'd been willing to respond to circumstances as they developed, rather than following predetermined plans that couldn't account for unexpected variables. All in favor of accepting federal partnership with Community Defense Institute expansion? Victoria asked, calling for the democratic vote that had become their standard decision-making process. The answer from both local and remote participants was unanimous: aye. As the video conference ended and the afternoon sun shifted lower through the warehouse windows, Victoria found herself reflecting on transformations that had reshaped not just her career, but her understanding of what success meant. The corporate world she'd inhabited for 10 years had measured achievement through individual advancement and competitive victory, but TechFlow had taught her about collective prosperity and mutual aid as more sustainable approaches to human organization. "Any regrets?" Joshua asked, recognizing the contemplative expression that appeared when Victoria considered the distance between her former life and current reality. "About giving up corner offices and 6-figure salaries to spend my days helping communities resist corporate predation?" Victoria smiled, watching Luna pack her homework into a backpack decorated with patches from national parks they'd visited during family vacations that prioritized shared experiences over luxury accommodations.
The evening routine that had developed over 18 months of blended family life carried them through dinner preparation, homework review, and the kind of casual conversation that created security for children who'd learned early that adults couldn't always protect them from economic forces beyond their control. Luna's bedtime stories now featured characters who solved problems through cooperation rather than competition, who built communities rather than conquered territories, who measured success by collective well-being rather than individual achievement. After Luna was asleep, Victoria and Joshua sat on their apartment's small balcony overlooking Portland's skyline, where glass towers housed businesses that were slowly learning to balance profit with community responsibility. The city's transformation mirrored their own, from a place where corporate power determined community fate to a model for how economic development could serve human needs rather than exploit them. Senate testimony next month, federal partnership negotiations, cooperative conversion consultations in 3 states. Joshua enumerated their upcoming responsibilities. Sometimes I wonder if we've bitten off more than we can chew. Victoria leaned against his shoulder, feeling the contentment that came from work that aligned with values rather than contradicting them. Remember what your father used to say about firefighting? When someone's in danger, you don't calculate the risk, you eliminate it. But we're not just eliminating immediate dangers anymore. We're trying to prevent the conditions that create those dangers in the first place. Which is exactly what communities need, Victoria replied, thinking about families like Maria Santos from Brennan Industries, who now owned shares in their workplace and had democratic input into decisions that affected their livelihoods. Prevention is more efficient than crisis response, even if it requires longer-term thinking than quarterly profit reports typically allow. Their phone buzzed with a message from Luna's teacher, reporting that her presentation on community helpers had been selected for the school district's annual showcase of student projects. The presentation would be displayed alongside work from high school students and would be reviewed by Portland City Council as an example of elementary education that connected academic learning with civic engagement. "She's going to change the world," Joshua said, pride evident in his voice, as he forwarded the message to extended family members who'd been following Luna's development into an articulate advocate for community cooperation. "She already has," Victoria replied, thinking about how Luna's innocent questions had often provided clarity during their most complex strategic discussions. "We all have. The question is whether we can change it fast enough to protect the communities that are still vulnerable to corporate predation." Portland's skyline glittered in the distance, lights marking buildings where traditional corporations were learning to coexist with employee-owned enterprises, where competitive advantage was being defined to include community benefit rather than community exploitation. The transformation wasn't complete, would never be complete, but it was underway, in ways that would have seemed impossible 18 months earlier. As they prepared for bed, Victoria felt gratitude for circumstances that had forced her to discover values she'd never known she possessed. The burning car that had brought her to Portland had destroyed her old life completely, but it had also made possible a future built on principles that corporate business schools had never taught. That love was more powerful than profit, that cooperation created more value than competition, and that ordinary people possessed extraordinary capabilities when they worked together to protect what mattered most. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new communities seeking assistance, new opportunities to prove that corporate power could serve human flourishing rather than exploit it. But tonight, in a small apartment overlooking a city that was learning to balance economic development with community well-being, a family built on love rather than law slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that they'd helped create a world where Luna could grow up believing that heroes weren't just people in stories. They were neighbors and teachers and parents who chose cooperation over competition, who built rather than destroyed, who proved that sometimes the most important victories were won by people who'd never intended to become heroes at all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.